Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Cloning has been a popular theme in Star Wars even before the Clone Wars and prequel trilogy were even started. I remember as a kid in 1996 when the first sheep Dolly was cloned and how that became a huge deal. Everyone was talking about cloning and how it would change society and bring back a lot of the things that we love that went extinct, like the woolly mammoth or Chris Farley. But it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. Still no Chris Farley and no woolly mammoths. We do have murder hornets though, so that is kind of cool. But one place where cloning did pop up was in my favorite movie franchise, Star Wars. Cloning in Star Wars is not only commonplace but pretty straightforward. Unlike in our own world full of scientific limitations and ethical limitations, in Star Wars, clones are commonly used as workers and also soldiers. Everything from how they look, how they think, and how they behave can be altered at the genetic level. It's pretty amazing and far ahead of anything our own scientists can achieve. But there are a few things that cloners in Star Wars struggle to do, and that is cloning for sensitive users. Today in this video, we're going to try to figure out why exactly that is. Now I know the new trilogy ended up being a hot garbage fire, especially the last installment, but the idea of keeping Darth Sidious alive by having him transfer his consciousness to a clone of his original body was actually something that was created far before Disney even took over the franchise. You see, Palpatine never intended to follow the rule of two set by Darth Bane. He instead wanted an eternal empire with himself at the helm forever. Palpatine had viewed the original Sith Emperor Vitiate as a great template to base his own rule off of. But to reach that point, he first had to figure out immortality. Palpatine was extremely lucky because his master was Darth Plagueis. Many of Palpatine's plans would have never reached its fruition without the help of his Mune teacher. See, Darth Plagueis was unlike any other Sith throughout the course of history. He wasn't obsessed with political power and domination nearly as much as he was fascinated with the nature of the Force. And as a Mune, he was naturally gifted with mathematics and science. After surviving an assassination attempt that took out the bottom half of his face, Plagueis began devoting himself solely to studying the Force and trying to figure out how it worked. Interestingly enough, very few individuals have ever carried out research about what the Force is and how it works. The Jedi would never do it because their ideology consists of blind devotion to the Force and trying to become one with it, not break it apart and understand how it works. It's for this reason that the Jedi jealously guarded Force-related objects like kyber crystals and ancient Sith texts. The Jedi feared the Force and its power, and believed that it should remain untouched and unexplored. The Sith, on the other hand, had no qualms about breaking the Force apart and trying to study how exactly it works and how they could bend it to their will. But as we mentioned before, most Sith users are very similar to, people on amphetamine 24/7. There are going to be some problems with their research. For one, the Sith selflessly guarded any secrets they uncovered, and more importantly, they tried to constantly kill each other, which led to the destruction of knowledge and property. The reason why humanity has become so advanced is that we do a good job at passing down information generation to generation. Unfortunately, the Sith were terrible at doing that, which is why their rule of two started in the first place. Plagueis eventually figured out through much experimentation that through careful practice, he could begin manipulating the actions of the midi-chlorians themselves. Midi-chlorians are microscopic life forms that live within every one of our cells, and they basically serve as the conduit between us and the Force. Everyone has midi-chlorians inside of them. The average human was said to have around 2,500 per cell, whereas Anakin had over 20,000 per cell. The more midi-chlorians one had inside of their body, the more powerful they were in the Force. Now, Darth Plagueis also found other special reasons why we have midi-chlorians in our body and why all life forms must have them as well. You see, midi-chlorians maintain the consciousness, or perhaps what we might call the soul. This was something Plagueis had learned through the passing of his own master, Darth Tenebrous. You see, Darth Plagueis, who's a pretty creepy guy, watched over his dying master and literally saw the midi-chlorians leave his body. And once the midi-chlorians began leaving his body, then the cells began to decay, and also the collection of neurons inside of our brain that create our consciousness also disappeared. The Dark Lord theorized that if he were able to communicate with the midi-chlorians, he could potentially convince them to do his bidding and repair and sustain the body forever. Unfortunately, midi-chlorians were pretty hard to control, and it took a very strong Force user to create that sort of dominance. Now, after that especially deadly assassination attempt we talked about before, Darth Plagueis becomes a recluse and focused most of his energy on trying to figure out how to control the midi-chlorians so that he could control life itself. Now, Plagueis' first experiments were with simpler organisms. He would essentially try to convince midi-chlorians to stay within the deceased body of a simpler organism, but just like pouring water into a vase which doesn't have a bottom, the midi-chlorians would kind of go in and then just kind of come out. It didn't work. But slowly, Darth Plagueis learned how to exert his will over the midi-chlorians. Then, with Darth Sidious's help, Plagueis was finally able to bring a sentient being back to life. He then killed that individual and repeatedly resurrected him until his body completely failed. Enlightened scientist or not, Darth Plagueis was still a psychopath. I think all the Sith were. Plagueis wouldn't end there, though. He and Sidious would go on to create life from the Force itself, which potentially could have resulted in the creation of Anakin Skywalker. From the earliest days, Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious had planned on subverting the balance within the galaxy by creating unrest in the Outer Rim. The original plan had been to create an army specifically trained to kill the Jedi. They first used the reptilian species known as the Yunchori, and were planning on cloning an entire army of them, but the species was ultimately deemed to be too volatile to control. Eventually, the idea of cloning a human army came into fruition and was chosen as a safer alternative. Now, Darth Sidious was heavily involved in the cloning process both before and during the Clone Wars. At the time, he was searching for a way to make himself immortal, and after killing Darth Plagueis, he no longer had someone who could revive him through manipulations of the midi-chlorians. There was another way to cheat death, however, and that was by using something known as spirit transference. It's actually what Darth Plagueis' own master, Darth Tenebrous, did the moment he died. You see, Darth Tenebrous had trained a group of midi-chlorians in his body to be extra resistant in the case of death. Plagueis actually observed these midi-chlorians and named them maxi-chlorians because they were a lot more powerful. And as the midi-chlorians in Darth Tenebrous' body began to fade away, the maxi-chlorians actually consolidated and tried to hijack Darth Plagueis' body. The maxi-chlorians were able to preserve the consciousness of Darth Tenebrous, or at least the chemical reactions that are responsible for his consciousness. Darth Sidious realized that this was the best course of action for him. He would train himself to preserve his consciousness in the case that he died. Of course, finding a vessel for himself proved to be much more difficult than he realized. For one, he needed an exceptional cloner who was also capable of keeping a secret. Near the end of the Clone Wars, Sidious actually attempts to contact Ko-Sai. She was a fugitive Kaminoan scientist that was at the top of her field. Unfortunately, she committed suicide before Darth Sidious could get his hands on her. After the fall of the Republic and the rise of the New Order, Darth Vader, while on the planet of Kashyyyk, manages to capture an extremely powerful Jedi youngling by the name of Galen Marek. Vader had planned on training Marek to become his own secret apprentice and eventually use him to kill Palpatine. Unfortunately, Marek dies from a Force explosion before that can happen. But he was so powerful, and his potential was so great that Vader decides to clone him. And so he brings his former apprentice's remains to Timara City on Kamino. Vader uses an accelerated cloning process that was perfected during the Clone Wars. While the average Kaminoan clone took 9 years to develop to adulthood, other methods like the Spartai clones could create an adult within a year or two. Now, obviously, these Spartai clones were inferior to the Kaminoan clones. They would oftentimes exhibit severe deformities and mental issues. Apparently, the brain still needs a lot of time to develop, and it's not something you can drastically speed up. The other problem was it was incredibly hard to clone Force sensitives. It just wasn't something that had been done at that point. You see, midi-chlorians, as we stated before, are intelligent, and perhaps they sense the clone's body as an unnatural vessel and are conditioned to treat it like a dead body. And as we mentioned before, midi-chlorians like leaving dead bodies. They don't want to stay in there, and probably neither would you if you were a midi-chlorian. And so over 1,000 Galen Marek clones were created and subsequently discarded because of physical deformities or a lack of connection to the Force or just general madness. It wasn't really until Subject 1138, wink wink, that Vader finally created a stable version of Galen Marek with all of his Force powers intact. Marek was a product of intense research and unlimited resources. The cloners had basically tried everything possible until it finally worked. It wasn't exactly the most efficient or smoothest process. While Darth Vader's Force-using clone was created through sheer luck and a massive amount of resources, Grand Admiral Thrawn would be the individual who finally unlocked the secret of cloning a Force user. You see, in Legends, Thrawn doesn't just get killed by a bunch of space-faring whales. Instead, he emerges from the ashes of the Empire and takes control of all of its remaining forces. While in pursuit of a way to neutralize the Jedi threat, Thrawn discovered an animal known as the Yislamari. It lived on a planet known as Meh, and developed a defense against Force-sensitive predators. The Ysalamiri would essentially create a bubble around itself completely devoid of the Force. Any Force users who entered the bubble would be unable to tap into their Force powers. The Ysalamiri didn't necessarily prevent the Force from reaching inside of its bubble. That would be impossible because all living things need the Force. Well, except for those degenerate Yuzhang Vong. But the point is, the Ysalamiri prevents a midi-chlorian from interacting with the Force while inside of its bubble. For whatever reason, the cloning process is considered abhorrent and against the fundamental rules of nature and the Force. And so when you clone an individual, you duplicate their imprint in the Force, and once those imprints interact with each other, it can create Force feedback, which leads to all sorts of problems within the clones. This is why so many Spartai clones succumb to clone madness, along with many of the Merrick clones. And also George Chabath, the clone of a famous Jedi Master who worked with Thrawn. Thrawn realized that if he placed the Ysalamiri near the cloning tanks, it would actually shield the clones from madness and the negative effect of Force imprinting and then feedback. So not only was Thrawn able to create stable clones, he was able to create them in just 15 to 20 days. In Legends and in canon, after Palpatine dies, he's able to preserve his spirit using that technique we mentioned before. He also has a secret facility full of clones of himself waiting for a spirit transfer. Unfortunately, Palpatine quickly found out that the bodies of these clones were unable to handle heavy Force usage. There must be something fundamentally different with how midi-chlorians interact with natural bodies and clone bodies. Perhaps the procedure that Emperor Palpatine used to clone his body was not as advanced as Thrawn's or even Darth Vader's repeated attempts. Regardless, what it meant was every time Palpatine used dark side Force powers, his body would basically decay at an extremely rapid rate. It just was not used to the Force coursing through its body. It was almost as if the clone body that Palpatine was using was an empty vessel that the Force was constantly trying to escape from. Ultimately, Palpatine's plan on using clone bodies was not sustainable, and he would seek to possess basically a naturally born powerful Force user. At the end of the day, the midi-chlorians were like life itself, and they were the gatekeepers between sentient beings and the Force. For one reason or another, these intelligent beings really disapproved the process of cloning, but with enough power and enough might, individuals like Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious and Darth Vader were able to bend the midi-chlorians to do their bidding. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.